This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 30 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Engaging Experts. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today's guest is Steve Silverman. Now, Mr. Silverman is the president of the Silverman Group, a consultancy that serves medical product companies on regulatory, strategy, and policy issues. He is also an expert consultant for NDA partners. Additionally, he has over 2 decades in federal service, including senior roles at the FDA. Now, Mr. Silverman holds a JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Mr. Silverman, thank you so much for joining me here today on Engaging Experts.
It's a pleasure to be here, and the podcast definitely can't go forward unless you call me Steve.
All right, Steve. Well, let's jump into it. With an extensive history in the FDA and medical device regulatory affairs, how did you first become involved in expert witnessing?
It was a pretty easy transition for me from the point where I decided to start my own consultancy, which happened roughly 3.5 or 4 years ago. I didn't initially plan to work as an expert witness, but in the course of digging into the consultancy, doing some traditional straight consulting work, and then thinking about other business opportunities, I thought, I've got litigation experience. I've deposed witnesses. I've presented witnesses at trial. I think that I have the basic competency to be an effective expert witness. And so I just layered that work stream into my consultancy. And that's really the genesis story.
Were you seeking expert witness engagements through your consultancy, or did you just get a call one day?
Honestly, a bit of both, but to be truthful, I got a call one day from an attorney at a law firm who was referred to me by one of his partners who I had worked with professionally. And he said, I have this work. We need an FDA expert regulatory witness. Is this something that you are interested in doing? And I said, with great confidence and very, very little ability, sure, no problem. I can do it. And I can tell you definitively that engagement was a hard fail. I'm happy to say there have been a number of subsequent very positive experiences, but the hubris I think that I brought into the process, kind of assuming that I could be an effective expert witness simply because of my prior litigation experience, my training as a lawyer, et cetera, not knowing what I know now. It was just ridiculous that I kind of blithely assumed that I could do a good job without doing basic homework.
Yeah, that's interesting. And some of the most helpful stories are the negative things because it happens to everybody. Everybody has a bad engagement. And often enough, it is their first or among their first few engagements. So let's break it down a little. What were some of the mistakes you made? And more importantly, or as importantly, what did you do to rectify them moving forward?
I mean, look, your point about negative lessons, I think, is well taken. And man, the lessons that I remember, unfortunately, are usually the ones that came with pain. And I don't want to live a life where I'm constantly getting beaten up in order to learn things, but those are the lessons that tend to stick. So in this case, I told the lawyer who had retained me, look, I haven't done this before, and I believe that I can do a good job. You let me know what you need, and we'll kind of go along from here, and you will advise what you're looking for, and I'll respond. That was a mistake. What I needed to do was to affirmatively and proactively confirm and shape the engagement, including timing, and then again, proactively advise the attorney, okay, look, if this is what you want, these are the materials that I am looking for. If you can provide them, this is what I would expect to review. This is what I think my deliverable is going to be, et cetera, et cetera. The onus was on me to be the professional and to really shape the engagement. And If I didn't know because I hadn't had prior expert experience what that looked like, then the onus was on me to figure it out. And I didn't. I assumed incorrectly that I would get clear guidance from the attorney about what he was looking for, including timing, and things went sideways. And candidly, the things that went wrong, they were on me. I failed to do what I needed to do. And there was pain and there were lessons learned.
Be that as it may, and it's very gracious of you to take it on the chin. Is there something, as an attorney yourself, is there something that attorneys could be doing or should be doing with new expert witnesses to make sure that they're adequately prepared? Is it not partially their responsibility, working for the end client, to make sure that their expert witness is not only an expert but ready to go?
Yeah, I think that that's true. I do. I mean, look, realistically, yes. If I were advising an attorney, I would say to him or her, look, it's the same responsibility. If you retain an expert, you have to make sure that you are proactively doing the things to shape the expert testimony in a way that works for your case, to make sure that the expert is supported, has the information that the expert needs, be proactive, et cetera, et cetera. And that's fine. And in the abstract, yes, those are things that experts should be able to rely on. My experience is that oftentimes that's not the case. And I don't want to be an expert. I don't like bad surprises. I don't want to be the person who gets a call saying, look, we need the report in a week, and then being nowhere close to having done the research, the preparation, et cetera, to get the deliverable to him or her on time. And if I'm not getting what I need from the attorney, then in my view, it's on me to define what's necessary to provide competent expert input to a case.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about depositions and trials. Have you been in a trial setting or a deposition setting yet?
I have been in a deposition setting as an expert, right? Which
Okay,
is to say, I have published expert reports and I have been deposed. I have not been to trial yet. I've been doing expert witness work for the last 3.5 years, so it's not a terribly long time.
sure.
And it's civil litigation. Most civil litigation settles, so it's not a huge surprise that I haven't been to trial. In my past life as an attorney for the government, I have been to trial and I have done many, 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 many depositions. In those cases, I was sitting there as the government's representative. I was a lawyer that was either taking or defending a deposition. I think the advantage for the work that I do right now is that none of the things that I see are particularly surprising. I know what it's like to be in a deposition, and frankly, I know what it's like to be in a trial setting.
As somebody who probably has put other expert witnesses in the hot seat as an attorney, how does it feel to have the shoe on the other foot? What's it like getting deposed?
You know, it's really interesting to me because I think that my role as an expert is not adversarial when I'm being deposed, for example, by opposing counsel, which is really different than the mindset that I had when I was an attorney representing the government, right? Where my job was to litigate and win cases. This is different. I have particular expertise about FDA regulatory practice, and my job ultimately is to explain, in my opinion, what the answer is to the regulatory issue that I have been asked to take a look at. And ultimately, I think that my, quote unquote client or constituent is the judge or the trier of fact. I mean,
Sure.
I need to explain to them what's going on. So if I am being deposed, for example, by opposing counsel, and they are asking me questions about my expert report, for example, sure, they're trying to poke holes and they're testing and prodding and sometimes misbehaving. But at the end of the day, my job is to stick by what my expert opinion is, explain that expert opinion, and then the underlying litigation follows the course that it follows.
Absolutely. Tell me a little bit about your preparation for getting into a deposition. For instance, I have a good number of interviewees who have some kind of a pre-deposition, or for that matter, pre-trial ritual. They like to meditate. They like to drink lots of coffee. They like a big meal or no meal, or heavy metal, you know. So what's your pre-deposition regimen if you have one?
There's a lot of incense burning. I'm not going to admit on mic to animal sacrifice, but I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Um, truthfully, I do not have a formal ritual that I follow, although I think that your other guests who do so are very smart and it makes sense. I would say this, not surprisingly, getting ready for a deposition involves a lot of preparation with the attorney whose client I'm representing, trying to get as much information as I can about what the opposing counsel is like, what they are looking for, the manner in which they have conducted themselves, and even looking at their depositions of other witnesses in the matter to get a sense of how it is that they operate. So that when I walk into a deposition, I feel like I am very cognizant of the points that I want to make, why I believe those points are well supported, how I would answer questions about them. It's really more just a function of being very comfortable with and on top of the statements and expert conclusions that I have reached previously.
Let's talk a little bit about etiquette. When you are being deposed, how do you like to present yourself? Are there any guidelines that you think that might be useful to newer expert witnesses regarding demeanor and etiquette?
Yeah, I think that's so. You know what? I actually have one really good piece of advice that was given to me at this point because I'm old, given to me decades ago. Um, which is to say, stand up. So while I am talking to you, I am standing. I have a very nice riser for my laptop, and I raise it up and I stand on my feet. I really, and in depositions, many of which are conducted remotely, much like this podcast is being done, there's no impediment to standing, and it's not rude to be standing while being deposed by opposing counsel, for example. I really believe that there's a physical and psychological benefit to being on my feet. It tends to make me more alert, more focused, less tired. And so, in some respects, the simple statement stand up is kind of trite. But on the other hand, I think it works and I think it's an easy thing to do. So that's my tip.
Are you able to do that over long periods of time? I've heard expert witnesses tell me that they've been deposed for 6 hours, 8 hours at a time. Are you able to stand up that long?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's so, and you're right. I mean, being on your feet for a very, very extended period of time can be tiring, and there's no sense in doing it if it's going to be physically punishing. By the same token, even in long depositions, breaks are frequent. If I need to take a break and then decide that I'm going to sit down for a while, it's fine. So it's a very manageable process. And also, just because I've built the habit, I tend to stand most of my work days, so it's really nothing. It's nothing terribly unusual.
You had mentioned earlier about cases going to settlement in civil litigation. With more cases
Mhm.
going to settlement, how does that affect your role as an expert witness?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question, and I gave that question some thought prior to our taping today because you were nice enough to give me a heads up about it. And here's what I would say. I really don't think that the number of cases going to settlement or the settlement trajectory radically changes my role as an expert. Part of the reason is because of the work that I'm doing. So I am not, for example, responsible for calculating monetary damages. That's not my expertise, and it's not my expertise, for example, to advise what the cost of a particular business transaction was, right? Um, my role, and I think this is probably true for many experts, is to say, okay, this is what the facts and events indicate, given the information that has been presented to me. This is my view of the situation, and these are the reasons that I am supporting the opinion that I have developed. And then really it's on the lawyer, for example, representing the client to say, look, we had this testimony. We think it's compelling testimony. Here is what our expert would be prepared to say if this case were to go forward at trial to a judge or a jury. And as a result, we believe, for example, that we are really well positioned to win at trial, and therefore we want to settle the case. And ultimately, the settlement takes the course that settlement often does between attorneys.
Do you see the role evolving in the future? Are there any trends that you've noticed, from the past couple of years that you've been doing this?
Yes, I think that comfort with technology is going to be a very important attribute
Sure.
for experts, which is not to say that experts need to be computer engineers or that they need to understand, how exactly artificial intelligence or machine learning works. But when a when a deposition is conducted, as has been the case for me, remotely and online, right? And each person in the deposition, me, the lawyer that I'm working for, opposing counsel, even the stenographer, are in different locations, right?
Sure.
And the deposition is moving forward. It's important to understand that that creates a somewhat different nature dynamic that's going to impact, for me, the way that I engage, how I feel about the interaction. I feel like under those circumstances, I need to be a little bit more alert, a little bit more careful, because there's not as much focus or adrenaline as I might find in an in-person setting. And there is some basic just blocking and tackling, making sure that I have a strong signal, talking to counsel in advance and say, look, if the call drops or things go sideways, what do you want to do? And then if those things occur, just being comfortable with those types of events.
Do you have a process? So if you lose power and everything, are you ready to go with, tethering to your cell phone, or do you have some backup solution?
I have a DoD level generator. I have my own. No, I mean, so to your point, the precautions that I take are the basic precautions, which is to say, I don't know enough to create my own Wi-Fi connections, but I have a good person who does, and I work with him to make sure that I have a strong Wi-Fi connection. I have confidence in my laptop. It's a good laptop. I know enough to know that if I'm being deposed, for example, and I have other applications open on my laptop, that I should close them down because it will improve bandwidth, and I don't want them to mysteriously appear during the deposition, et cetera, et cetera. So
Sure.
there's nothing, I mean, there is nothing magical about what I am doing. By the same token, it's worth a little bit of kind of basic due diligence about what's different when depositions or other types of interactions are happening um, online, virtually. The other thing that I will say is, and this is truly, truly, truly a personal preference thing. When I am being deposed, or I am talking for the first time with counsel, or talking to witnesses, what have you, I will put on my big boy clothes. I mean, I'm having a conversation with you where I'm wearing a dress shirt. I decided not to wear a sport coat because I knew that none of this was going to be recorded
Right.
video. But the process of actually putting on professional clothes And standing in the way that I have said, I think helps to get me into the right mindset. And so, like I said, that's a personal preference. I don't think that's a magic formula. But when I am in a deposition setting, for example, I want to be the best version of me, the most present, the most focused. And I feel like, as ridiculous as it sounds, the quote unquote suiting up actually does make sense.
Absolutely, and you're not the first person who's said so. Um, let's talk about some of the cases that you've done. Have you been in any cases that have either reinforced the way that you do something or changed the way that you go about doing something as an expert witness? Obviously, beyond the singular bad first case.
Yeah, look, my job as an expert is to actually let me take a step back and talk
Sure.
about what kind of expert work I do, right? Because there for a lot of your guests, they won't know. So I am an FDA regulatory expert. So what does that mean? I worked at FDA for a long time and I've worked in that regulatory space for a long time. Most of my work focuses on medical devices, but not all of it. I also do some work with drugs and other types of medical products. And my job pretty much uniformly involves explaining to counsel, to triers of fact, what have you, what do FDA regulatory requirements mean? And that makes sense because the FDA regulatory requirements are, I think, not, they are not intentionally confusing, but they're a little bit arcane. I think that if you take a look at any one of a variety of government agencies, whether it's Department of Energy or Department of Defense, or border security, whatever, their regulatory requirements potentially are going to be confusing. And people who are unfamiliar with those organizations, for good reason, are not going to understand what those regulatory requirements are. So it makes sense to bring in people from the outside who have lived within those regulatory environments for long periods of time to say, like, okay, what does X regulatory provision really mean? Or if a company does A, B, and C, did they meet regulatory requirements? Did they not? If they didn't meet the regulatory requirements, well, what does that mean? Like, does it mean that they're so one of the questions that I will get answered, or excuse me, get asked a lot is, okay, if there are quality requirements for device manufacturers that exist very broadly for all of their products that have already made it to the market, and the FDA comes in and does an inspection and finds that certain quality requirements have not been satisfied properly, right? So there is a violation. Does that mean that the product produced at the facility where the violation was found is unsafe or
Hmm.
ineffective, right? Because oftentimes that will be the allegation. And for reasons that I am not going to bore you with, the answer is no. But there's really no reason why attorneys who don't do FDA work all the time or other individuals who are not familiar with FDA would know the answer to that question. I do, because this is the world that I've lived in for a couple decades.
Sure.
My job is then to explain to the attorney, to opposing counsel, to others, like, okay, look, this is what the regulatory requirement says. Here's the implications of violating it. Here's what it means for ultimately the medical device or the drug or other product that comes to consumers.
In your field, is there a certain amount of dynamism? Does the law change frequently? Do you have to stay on top of changing regulations and trends in that manner, or is it fairly static?
I think that's a great question. And I can see you on video, so I see you smiling. So yes, let me compliment you with the excellence of your question. Profound. But it really is a good question because the answer is yes, things change in at least two respects, which I'll explain. And I do think it's important to pay attention. And I will also talk about the fact that there are some things that are really kind of bedrock and don't change. So let me start with that. Look, the bedrock. FDA has a bedrock requirement for medical products that they need to be safe and effective before they come to market. And there needs to be some type of determination by the agency about product safety and efficacy that is a prerequisite for getting the products onto the market, right? You cannot go into the pacemaker business and start selling your products, ignoring the fact that all of those products have to go through FDA review before you start selling,
Sure.
right? That's bedrock. And FDA, I mean, it is really in the FDA's DNA to say we want safe and effective medical products coming to market, right? Now, what that means in 2025, in terms of the evolution of technology and the extraordinary change that we have seen in the political environment, is really variable. So, even leaving politics to the side, looking back in the device context over the last decade, there have been absolutely transformative changes in medical devices. The impact of technology on devices has been a tectonic shift for the industry. So if you look, for example, at things like like heart pacemakers, right? I believe that I can pretty confidently say that there are no longer pacemakers being sold that do not have high technology software capability, which means that there is software that helps the pacemakers to function properly in the heart, but there is also very, very advanced communication between the pacemaker and the company that makes it so that there is a kind of constant feed of information to the company, which can then be provided to the healthcare provider. So there is real-time data monitoring to see what's happening with the pacemaker once it's been implanted. And that is just one of a basket full of examples. In the diagnostic space, right? There are huge, huge, huge changes in terms of the ability for doctors to read and interpret X-rays that is powered by huge, huge computing capability and artificial intelligence, right? And so instead of having 1,000 images that a doctor can get access to that builds on his or her years of experience looking at films, knowing what's a problem, what's not a problem. They suddenly have hundreds of thousands of images, and they are not the ones who are initially looking through those images. It's not to say that the docs are ceding responsibility to technology, because they're not, but the scope of information and the relevance and the references that can be drawn from the technology are jaw-dropping.
How do you stay on top of all of it? How do you stay informed? Do you read journals? What is in your field? How do you remain current?
The way to do it, I think, is to be reasonably thoughtful about where it is that I want to dig in and where I may want to simply know that something exists, but I'm not going to be somebody who has a lot of knowledge closely at hand. So, for example, I like talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other technological issues as they relate to devices because I think that they are incredibly interesting, right? And actually, in my expert work and in my consulting work, the huge minority of matters that I handle involve artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, what have you. They don't. Still, I think it's just incredibly interesting. So, yes, when I look at journal articles or trade publications for the device industry and they speak to those topics, I'm likely to read them. If somebody is doing a webinar, for example, on topics that fall within those categories, I'm likely to tune in. There are other things that are super, super important, like changes in how clinical trials are being conducted for devices and other FDA regulated products. And I think that's an example of something that I just Yeah, I know about it a little bit, but if I have an attorney who says I need to know a lot about an issue in this area, I'm going to have to study up.
That's something that a lot of experts have to do. Obviously, you're not going to have the entire wealth of knowledge, that might be pertinent to your field at your fingertips. Is that billable, in your opinion, if you have to do some additional research into in something that is ostensibly in your area? Is that a billable occurrence?
I think that it absolutely is billable, and I think that it's frankly basic responsible practice to be very transparent with the attorney about the fact that I'm going to do the work and I'm going to bill for it, right? And
Sure.
so I've never ever had a problem with any attorney that I'm talking to saying like, I think I need 5 or 6 hours to go back and learn about this topic in order to speak about it competently. And I just want to let you know, and it's just going to be part of my preparation process. I think that the attorneys who I've dealt with uniformly have said, yeah, okay, that's fine. If they had a problem with it, I'd have the conversation, but that hasn't happened. And again, speaking for me, I mean, I have had jobs in the past where I have walked into a room and have been asked to speak to topics where I felt like walking into the room, very, very heavy levels of imposter syndrome. And I don't like that feeling. And so if I had an attorney who said to me, I don't really want you to do the background work, I'm not sure that it's an engagement that I would want to pursue.
Sure. Along those lines, have you had to say no to a significant number of engagements?
The answer to that question is no. I have not had to say no to a significant number of engagements, but I think that the reason that I haven't had to is that I've been able to define pretty clearly what it is that I'm interested in doing and what I'm not on the front end, and what I'm willing to say and not on the front end. So, for example, there is a lot of product liability litigation involving medical products, right? Plaintiffs suing medical product manufacturers, for example, claiming that the product that they used failed and they were harmed. I don't work in that area. It's a personal choice, right? And
Sure.
so I just don't want to be an expert in that context. And so what that means is I don't have to in the midst of a representation turn down or turn away lawyers because I don't begin doing that kind of work. By the same token, I'm usually able at a pretty early point in time to tell counsel what I think my position is going to be. Right? The caveat is like I have to learn, here's what I need to know, here's what I'm going to dig into, but I can give them a 10,000 foot answer. And usually, sometimes that will happen even before I'm engaged. And if that's not the answer that works for the attorney, then they don't engage me. And that's okay.
Absolutely. Let's back up and talk about a few general ideas regarding expert witnessing. Why are expert witnesses important to just jurisprudence overall? Why do we have expert witnesses? Why is the work that we do important and significant?
The best answer that I can give you, Noah, is what I was talking about before, in terms of I know a lot about a very narrow band of law and regulatory practice, right? If you need somebody to explain to you how FDA regulates medical products, and in particular how it regulates devices, I can do a good job of telling you about that, right? It's unreasonable, in my opinion, to expect that an attorney who is more of a generalist and is handling a commercial matter, for example, that individual is going to develop the same level of knowledge and expertise. Certainly, they are going to understand a lot of the things that I will talk about, but not with the same depth. And to the extent that it is unreasonable to expect them to develop that expertise, I think it's even more unreasonable to expect that a judge or a jury is going to have the expertise, right? And so inevitably, there is going to be litigation in which parties are arguing about the significance of an FDA regulation or FDA legal practice or FDA practice and fact, right? And they need somebody to come in and say, okay, like actually, let me just tell you, this is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean. Here's the landscape. And then that information informs, right? Informs the overall trial process. The other thing that I'll say, Noah, that's really interesting for me at least is, I can't think of I would be hard pressed to think of a single matter that I've been involved in where the issues that I am testifying about are the only major issues in play, right?
Sure.
I am a piece of the puzzle, right? Either the plaintiff or the defendant has said, "Oh, well, our our case is supported in part by FDA statute or regulatory practice in the following ways, right? And it's an argument, and the attorney that is dealing with that argument needs to competently get enough information to manage it. But that's not the only thing that they're going to have to deal with. So fine, I'm part of a larger team. I've got a piece of the puzzle, and I can make management of that piece of the puzzle a little bit easier so that the attorney can then focus on all the other stuff.
Speaking of being on a team, have you been on larger teams that have a number of expert witnesses, perhaps consultants, other parties? And if so, what are those interactions like? To what extent do expert witnesses work with other members of the trial team besides the attorney?
In my experience, insofar as I have been involved in larger teams, it really is a function of working with the trial team. So the individuals who I come to know and engage with most regularly are part of a discrete team of lawyers who I work with over the course of the litigation. That being said, right, there are a number of firms, including the firm that is kindly hosting this podcast, that aggregate experts and make them available to attorneys and others so that when they have particular expert needs, rather than having to go out individually and search the earth for the right person, they're able to go to a consultancy and say, okay, look, this is basically what I am looking for. This is what I need. Do you have somebody who can fit the bill? And I have that relationship, like as you know, with NDA partners, with other consultancies. And when my skill set is one that meets the needs of counsel, then they put my name forward. What I will tell you, what I mean, so in some respects, Noah, what I'm thinking is like, okay, big deal. Most people know this. What's the takeaway? And I think that the takeaway for the folks listening to this podcast is um for is this, which is be very clear about what I can do and what I can't do, right? I mean, it's incredibly important to say both to the quote unquote aggregator and to counsel, like, geez, I don't know exactly about the issue that you're raising, but I think I can learn enough to come up with an answer, or to say, like, yeah, I got this, and here's what my answer would be, or to say, like, no, this is not me. I don't know about it. I can't do it. And then if if it happens, as is often the case, to say, oh, hey, you know what? I actually have a suggestion. I know somebody. I'm not the person, but I think I know the person. And that's gold. I mean, I have had lawyers come back to me later saying, like, oh, this is a different matter, but I remember talking to you and I really appreciated the recommendation, and now I want to work with you. So it's just a great dynamic.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, do you have any advice for expert witnesses, in particular newer expert witnesses, or in fact attorneys that are working with expert witnesses?
I do, Noah, and I will chunk my response into the advice that I would give to newer attorneys, or excuse me, to attorneys, and the advice that I would give to newer experts, right? Um, And so let me start with those experts and say emphatically, being an expert witness is a skill, right? It is not something that you are born with. It is not like your ability to play pro basketball, right? You don't need to be you don't need to grow to 6'8" and to be able to shoot 3 points shots on the regular. It is a skill. It can and must be acquired. And there are lots of resources out there that are available to expert witnesses to get better at being an expert witness, to get better at writing concise and compelling expert reports, to get better at giving depositions and delivering testimony. And like anything else associated with our professional work, it requires diligence and practice. So, for the individuals who are expert witness on U.S. nuclear regulatory policy, great, you're a genius, and you literally know how nuclear bombs and other devices are built. That means you're amazing. That doesn't mean that you can do a great job talking about it to your own lawyer, to a judge, to opposing counsel. So that's okay. It means that you just need to learn, and that is a function. That is a function of proactively going out, figuring out what resources are needed, and then gathering and applying those resources. Don't make the mistake that I made, which was to assume that the attorney that I was working for would give me what I needed to do a good job. So that is the new consultant chunk. For the attorney, right, all I would say is this. I get it. I get it that you are super busy. I get it that you have 100 plates that you are trying to keep spinning. I am just one of those plates, and your job is not to live to make sure that all of my needs are met in the timing and the timeline that works best for me, right? Understood. My job is to make things easier for you, to give you what you need so that you can have the best outcome that you want to achieve for your client. To do that, right? To do that, let's get real clear very, very early on in terms of what the deliverable is, how it's going to be delivered, what is a good outcome for you, what does a good product look like, and when do you need it, right? So invest the time on the front end to clarify those basic issues in consultation with the experts so that there is a clear view as to what the expert will be providing. And if there is any discrepancy between what you're trying to develop in terms of your case theory and what the expert can credibly say, bring that to the surface soon and create an environment in which that kind of information is being communicated by the expert at an early point in time.
Excellent sage advice. Steve, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for giving me the chance to prattle on.
Absolutely. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Engaging Experts. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Engaging Experts. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com.